Well, hello, welcome to Compassion Matters, a podcast of the Passional Church Collective. We focus on nurturing compassion-centered, trauma-informed leaders and communities. What is compassion? Why does it matter? Compassion is a concept that's not easy to define, but you know it when you see it, and you know it when you don't. In this podcast, when we say compassion, we mean a sensitivity to suffering and self, and a desire to commit and alleviate and prevent it. I'm Michael Adam Beck. I'm a pastor, I'm a professor, author, coach, and consultant who's passionate about the intersection of theology and sociology. And I believe that the cultivation of compassionate communities can help heal a world experiencing an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. So join us as we explore matters of compassion and compassion becoming matter through research and conversations with experts and practitioners. And in each episode, I try to pair up a theological concept and a sociological concept, or we'll put a theologian in conversation with a sociologist and see kind of what can we learn from that intersection. We're doing something a little new here where we're curating the top performing Substack essays, and we're bringing them to life here through the podcast. So these pieces that we're going to do podcast episodes on sparked the most conversation or had the most shares and engagement or questions. And so we're going to offer those in an audio form with added commentary and reflection to kind of go deeper. And from a theological standpoint, this episode interrogates the church's missional identity rooted in our call to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That is, in fact, the United Methodist mission statement, and I'm going to share a little bit about more about that. And I'm going to pick on my own hive a little bit, the Methodist, as we explore it. But it critiques how institutional churches often drift from this calling into self-preserving maintenance. And it invites a return to the Jesus way of self-donation, where love, justice, and relational transformation are central. And so we're going to draw on core Christian themes: incarnation, discipleship, ecclesiology, the nature and purpose of the church. But sociologically, the episode uses frameworks like Allport and Ross, religious orientation theory. That goes back to 1967, I think, when they first started writing about that. We're going to look at Bourdieu's social capital theory to evaluate how the church functions as a social body. It will also assess how extrinsic religiosity fails to generate compassion and how churches can either build or deplete social capital in their communities. And in this episode, we're also going to engage the broader trends of religious disaffiliation and loneliness and institutional decline as societal phenomenon that require missional responses. So really at the intersection of theology and sociology is this urgent question: are our churches forming people into communities of compassion that can transfigure the world? And are we just merely kind of maintaining religious institutions? And so by pairing missional theology with measurable sociological constructs like intrinsic religiosity, social capital, Bourdieu's portrayal of that, not necessarily Robert Putnam's version of it, which you might be familiar with from earlier episodes. But this episode is going to call for a radical reframing of church vitality metrics, not around attendance or budgets, but around relational, spiritual, communal engagement and discipleship, transformation in a believer's life. So let's get into it. How do we measure this? It seems to be the inevitable question that comes up in every training that our team does. So I want to attempt to formulate an answer to that. About over 10 years ago now, actually a decade, I wrote a white paper titled New Missional Metrics for a Blended Ecology of Church. Just recognizing that in my own churches where I served, that there was a disconnect and a mismatch between when we talked about vitality, what the congregation meant and what those of us who are engaged in fresh expressions were thinking about as vitality. There was kind of a disconnect in what we were measuring and putting into our reports and what was actually happening on the boots on the ground. And realizing that a lot of stuff with fresh expressions and how we do this kind of incarnational way of ministry wasn't really being picked up on the reports. And I'll talk in a later episode about Sally Engel Mary, an indicator theory, and a landmark article from her called Measuring the World. We're not going to get into that today, but indicators, measures, metrics, they don't just report or kind of give surveillance to behavior to get data. They actually shape behaviors. They actually, what we report, what we measure doesn't just kind of put our reality into a data. It shapes our reality. It shapes the behaviors of the actors in a social system. And so realizing that fresh expressions not being measured would be a major stumbling block institutionally as a denomination if we were going to really try to follow the Holy Spirit and see this movement kind of unleashed in the church. So I had this white paper I wrote. I've made it available. It needs a lot of updating. It's pretty ancient, but I sent it around to denominational leaders and colleagues. They read it. They often responded, yes, this makes sense. I see this. Of course. Yeah, we're all saying this, right? You just put it in words. But that was really as far as we got. However, today there is a renewed energy around the missional metrics conversation. We have a bunch of people engaged in this conversation in multiple networks and congregations and denominations, and particularly in the United Methodist Church, where we have a missional metrics cohort. And I'm doing a study at the University of Florida right now, the first wave of that study called Mapping the Metrics. We did some focus group data there with developers, stakeholders, and the denomination. And all of that is available in the Substack if you want to look closer at it. But what is clear is that our current metrics are good at measuring decline. Religious affiliation or people's self-reporting membership and worship attendance continue to decrease. And that shift coincides with the broader decline in institutional religion just in general, which is traditionally provided ethical frameworks for pro-social behavior, some would argue. Some would say not so much. But as religious participation declines, loneliness and social isolation are on the rise as traditional church networks that foster community are diminishing. You can see the Surgeon General's report, Vivek, who started in 2023 with the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, did a follow-up on the firearm violence epidemic, and then just the beginning of this year wrote his parting prescription, really digging into the continued loneliness epidemic that we're in. So the decline in church participation is particularly evident in denominations like the United Methodist Church. You could fill in the blank with any of the seven sisters of mainline denominational churches in America, but we've seen a steady drop in membership since the 1960s, and then the COVID-19 pandemic further accelerated that decline, as did the disaffiliation of congregations from the UMC to form the Global Methodist Church, kind of a conservative break-off of the UMC. And the UMC has faced significant loss of membership, resources, and leadership. And this fragmentation has not only weakened the church's ability to present a unified mission, but also diverted attention and energy from outreach and mission, deepening internal conflict and hindering its overall vitality. So the resulting uncertainty has left many congregations struggling to maintain momentum and engage their communities effectively. And these trends collectively underscore the urgent need for the church to adapt, or more specifically, to appropriately measure the spirit-led adaptation that's already occurring in local settings. And so what we measure matters. It programs the behavior of the people in the system, and clergy and congregations put a lot of energy and effort into things they'll be asked to report. So if you consider the annual evaluation of pastors in the UMC, for instance, there's 21 identified skills and behaviors, and only one skill, reaching out to and supporting the community beyond the church's walls, is truly an outwardly focused indicator, right? So these assessments often focus on internal priorities such as preaching and pastoral care, rather than innovative outreach, which often push pastors towards institutional maintenance rather than mission-focused outreach. And this creates a cycle where pastors prioritize satisfying members' needs rather than pursuing new missional efforts. And I've experienced this repeatedly in my own congregations where I'm evaluated not on anything we were doing with the fresh expressions, the lives being changed, the people coming to Christ, the people sharing Jesus stories, and the third places that we're meeting in, or how many people who had no connection with the church at any point in their life are now participating in these things. None of that was really measured on our evaluation, but that's what the churches would be evaluating me on. And typically not super excited about my performance if all they were looking at was kind of the inherited metrics, right? But does what we've been measuring really matter? Remember, I like to play with this word, matter, anything that has mass and takes up space. So flesh and blood, does it really matter or measure that? And so in light of these changes, the traditional metrics of church vitality, like membership, worship attendance, giving, no longer suffice in themselves. Not saying we should not measure those things, but those things don't give an accurate snapshot of vitality in the 21st century. Historically, these metrics have measured the internal health of churches. However, in the blended ecology, where traditional forms of ministry are living in symbiotic relationship with the new expressions of church, these metrics fail to capture the full scope of the church's outward-facing mission. So transvocational ministry, another word that I made up, and I'm going to do a whole episode on this, but you've heard of bivocational, right? So two-ness, usually a minister will have a job and be a pastor. Co-vocational, a with voice, or we turn our work, our job, our business, or just our daily living into a ministry. Transvocational ministry, another thing, is where maybe we have people who had a whole career in one field, and then we go into ministry and the only option for them is like abandon that career and just go full-time ministry, rather than saying, why don't you keep going with that career and find a way to also be in ministry or turn that into a ministry. Or we have so many clergy that quit the ministry every year, a lot of because of the frustrations that I'm sharing here. But we have all this education, we have all this training and such, and maybe guaranteed appointment wasn't why we got into the thing to begin with, but that we want to serve Jesus and create community with people. And so we take all of that education, and through a transfiguration of our spiritual lives and our vocation, we find new entrepreneurial kind of edge ways to be engaged in ministry. So I'm going to do a whole episode, come back to transvocational ministry, but this is where really clergy and laity work together as partners in God's mission. And that also requires a new approach to measuring vitality. So the church is a community of people living in loving relationship with God, one another, the wider church in the world. That's how we talk about it in Fresh Expressions. And the simple framework for rethinking metrics should focus on the real flesh and blood, matterized people with two key relational dimensions: a personal dimension, right, and a communal dimension. This is a gross oversimplification, but stay with me on this. So personally, how are people growing in love and union with God and neighbor? Like an inner transfiguration, right? Communal, how do congregations impact the community where they're situated? So like a communal transfiguration, the presence of Jesus through that community in the wider, parish. These two key relational dimensions are clearly articulated in for example, the current United Methodist mission statement, which states, and I'm going to quote, "The mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, and local churches and extension ministries of the church provide the most significant arenas through which disciple making occurs." So making disciples involves personal formation in the way, truth, and life of Jesus, more people living the way of Jesus together, doing Jesus things, leads to a transfigured world, a more compassionate world, a just world, a healed world, right? And while this is inspired by Matthew 28:19, go make disciples, the Great Commission, the mission statement has certain limitations, and it could be rightly called the great omission, because it leaves out the active call to go into the world as part of discipleship. So the mission statement is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. What Jesus says is go. The Greek word is peruo, or as you go out into the world on the journey of going, make disciples. So when you take that go off, you get serious problems, right? All the arrows are not pointing out anymore the way Jesus points them, but they're all pointing in. Come to us. Come and be part of what we're doing, rather than let's go out into the world and be and make disciples. So the phrasing implies a passive model of discipleship. We're waiting for people to come rather than actively seeking them out. We're always playing hosts, not the guest. What Jesus sends us out as guests to be good guests, not hosts. It also reflects the deeper challenge that institutional processes and policies, while intended to facilitate mission, have unintentionally contributed to passivity, restricting churches from engaging in transformative mission to our communities. So I want to move into like some sociology here and how it can guide our metrics. And it's kind of shocking to me that there's kind of a big disconnect between theology and sociology, and like we don't really talk to each other. There's departments, and if a higher education institution even has a theology department, they certainly don't work together with sociologists or use their tools or metrics and so on. So from the perspective of sociologists, these are indeed constructs we can measure. We measure this stuff, in short, as sociologists. And in my research at UF right now, I'm exploring, the relationship between compassion, religiosity, religious affiliation, political affiliation. And I'm aiming to explore their role in the compassion gap, which is really the erosion of empathetic responses in the face of societal challenges like political division, loneliness, and inequality. And compassion is really, in my research, part of one dimension of this larger concept called wisdom, which has three dimensions: a cognitive, reflective, and a compassionate dimension. Again, I'll save that for another episode, but the primary theoretical framework for my current research is grounded in Allport and Ross's religious orientation theory. And that distinguishes between intrinsic religiosity, which is characterized by a deep personal commitment to faith, and extrinsic religiosity, which involves engaging with religion primarily for external rewards. So religious affiliation refers to an individual's formal association with a specific religious group or tradition, regardless of the depth or the personal significance of their engagement with its teaching or practices. While religious affiliation marks group membership, forms of religiosity emphasize personal belief orientation, the internal integration of faith into daily life. And these distinctions are essential, as religious affiliation alone may not lead to an increase in social compassion or wisdom. So extrinsic religiosity actually shows weaker association with prosociality. So while intrinsic religiosity has been linked to heightened prosocial behaviors and greater well-being, so these different ways that people or motivations for their religious participation have different motivations and meanings and implications for our lives, and we can actually measure these things. So our current metrics, though, they primarily measure affiliation and extrinsic religiosity, not intrinsic religiosity. It's also possible to measure community impact. And here I turn to my friend Pierre Bourdieu's concept of social capital, which provides a valuable framework for understanding how churches create value through relationship. Bourdieu's concept predates and is similar but distinct from Robert Putnam. I think I've mentioned Putnam earlier episodes around bowling alone, the loss of social capital, neighborly good. But Bourdieu's theory of capital highlights the plurality of social fields where various forms of capital, economic, cultural, social, for example, define the positions and possibilities of actors within these fields. So social capital in particular refers to the resources gained from group membership and social networks, which can enhance an individual's social standing in different areas of life. This capital is produced through relationships and is crucial in determining how economic and cultural capital is leveraged. So social capital also has symbolic dimension. So where the recognition and distinction it provides plays a critical role in sustaining power dynamics and influencing social positions. So social capital is a concept centered on social relationships, and it includes elements like networks and civic engagement and trust and norms of reciprocity, and has gained prominence in academic and policy debates since the 1990s. It is a complex, multi-dimensional asset that facilitates cooperation and collective action for mutual benefit, with types such as bonding and bridging and linking. Though it can be measured at various levels, the concept remains elusive, with challenges in kind of defining and quantifying and empirically testing its effects. Thus, congregations that have social capital in their communities can have a transfiguring effect. And conversely, congregations can function as closed systems, which can be completely disconnected from the larger social ecosystem for a time. But with no output and no influx of new people, energy, and resources, closed systems eventually stagnate and die in comparison to open systems. So social capital, comprised of networks and trust and relationship, offers a more holistic measure of church vitality than the inward focus metrics of membership and attendance. So in the blended ecology of church, vitality should be measured by the social capital it generates through its outreach, its engagement with the broader community, rather than by passive metrics that reflect only what is collected. So as church leaders and people involved in the church at any level, it's time to shift our focus from inward metrics only to outward metrics, tracking relationships and spiritual growth and missional impact in the broader community. So the true vitality of a church lies in its outward-facing mission, how it engages and transforms its community. Drawing inspiration from Bourdieu's theory of social capital, churches must track how they build relationships and foster community engagement. So instead of focusing on what is inside the church, we should measure how the church is creating connections and networks that extend beyond the walls of the building, in addition to the internal measures. To assess the social capital a church generates, we can track, for instance, the number of new relationships formed with unchurched or dechurched individuals, the degree to which church members are integrated into community-based social networks, the tangible social impact of the church's service, mission, and outreach initiatives. It's necessary to kind of think about the difference between technical and adaptive metrics. So there's a Methodist thought leader, Junius Dotson, and he gave us some distinctions around counting and measuring. So we recognize the need to shift focus from numbers alone to trends, movement, and transformation. So example, counting metrics: how many dollars were pledged this year? How many members are active in the church? How many attendees are present on Sunday? Those are counting metrics. Measuring metrics would be our worship participants showing consistent and deep engagement with the life of the church. Is financial giving increasing over time as a sign of spiritual growth? How many professions of faith have been made over time? For example, how many new people are professing faith and coming into the communal ecosystem? Adaptive metrics must address deeper spiritual questions, such as how far has a person come on their spiritual journey? How deep is their faith rooted, and how is it being lived out in their daily life? How wide is our communal impact as a congregation? And this shift allows churches to measure movement, not just attendance. So to ensure alignment with the mission of the UMC, in my case, in a blended ecology, new metrics are needed that capture the dynamic nature of both the inherited and the fresh expression churches, congregations, communities, whatever you want to call them. So these metrics should reflect the outward focus of the mission, moving beyond the traditional inward-looking measures to those that assess the going, putting the go back in the United Methodist mission statement, aspect of disciple making as we go out into the world, right? So the fresh expression movement and blended ecclesial models introduce both opportunities and challenges for how we assess mission and discipleship, and metrics should reflect both the inherited expressions of church and the new decentralized fresh expressions models. So I propose some adaptive frameworks for some metrics. So, for example, relational engagement assesses the depth and quality of relationships formed through ministry and mission. So an example of this could be how many new meaningful relationships have been formed through acts of service, for example. Discipleship movement indicators, they would evaluate not just attendance, but spiritual growth trends. So examples of this would be increased frequency of personal prayer or new participation in a small group over time, right? Indicators of social and community impact would be how well is the local church responding to visible human needs in its immediate context? Or so for an example of that, like relationships built through community engagement initiatives. In the contextual innovation and experimentation indicator space, how well is the congregation adapting to new models of mission? So an example of that could be how many new fresh expression communities were launched in the past year, or how successful are they in drawing in new participants into a shared faith experience. Then there could be gateway participation metrics, so move beyond the traditional metrics of worship attendance to track spiritual pathways. So an example of that would be participation through life stage events, mission opportunities, or small group attendance. So drawing inspiration from the Church of England's approach to living into a mixed ecology, I propose a narrative-based framework centered around the loving first journey. In fresh expression, we have this journey that we follow: listen, love, and serve, build relationship, explore discipleship, church taking shape, multiply, or repeat. So a missional framework that tracks key phases of that engagement and growth. So for example, let me just walk through the stages and suggest some possible, indicators for each. In the listening phase, the first phase in a church's missional journey, listening to community. So metrics here could include number of prayer walks conducted, frequency of conversations with non-church members, time spent in key locations, first, second, third places for community engagement. What new insights have been learned from listening? So these questions help evaluate how well a congregation is engaging with the broader community and discerning its needs. Loving and serving, the next phase of the journey, is to actively love and serve the community. So that's identifying assets and organic needs and responding to them. And relevant metrics for this could be how well does the congregation understand and serve the passions, dreams, and needs of its neighbors? Number of partnerships with other organizations already meeting similar needs. Names of individuals or groups served and how relationships are deepening through that serving. So tracking authentic needs versus imposed ones. These metrics demonstrate how a congregation is moving beyond service to developing authentic relational connections, which moves us into the next phase of the journey, which is building community. So as relationships develop, a church must foster a sense of community and belonging. And metrics in this phase could ask frequency of gatherings and facilitation of these gatherings. Who's doing that facilitation? Whether digging deeper conversations are taking place and is trust being built. How many regular attendees are showing vulnerability and connection, for example. So these metrics would kind of measure the formation of community beyond transactional relationships, which churches are really good at measuring. In the exploring discipleship phase, or sharing Jesus, or sharing faith, whatever you want to title that phase, but at that stage, new disciples begin to show a hunger for deeper engagement with Jesus. And so key questions for measurement could include things like how many individuals express a desire for more spiritual depth or discipleship, opportunities for discipleship in the forms they take, prayer, scripture, study, service, those things. How many people in the congregation are equipped to share a Jesus story, those quick little sermonic conversations that we lead. These questions gauge the church's ability to invite people into the journey of spiritual growth and deepen their commitment to the mission. Church taking shape, in that phase, the church begins to take the shape of a missional community with a clear outward focus. And so metrics could include how many baptisms, professions of faith, or celebrations of Holy Communion occur. Examples of an up, in, out model and practice. So worship, community, outreach, connection to the larger body, up, in, out, and of. The level of engagement with both fresh expressions and inherited church, including what we call those bridge backs, where individuals return to the life of the traditional church. They get engaged in a fresh expression and they kind of bridge back into the inherited church. And this phase reflects the church's maturation into a full expression of its mission, including the ongoing outreach and engagement with the larger body of Christ. So just some additional metrics I think of as a practitioner of fresh expressions in the blended ecology: preaching and lay leadership. So the number of people that are involved in the preaching team and their level of engagement. In our network of churches, we have 7 lay preachers that preach on a rotation equally with the pastors. The percentage of lay-led small groups and care teams, the laity are owning that and leading that. Active participation of lay leaders in key ministry areas such as discipleship and pastoral care. Another thing I think about a lot, especially in the 21st century, that's becoming increasingly important, is space utilization and financial sustainability. So how often and how well space is being used for both ministry and community engagement? Are we just using our buildings to worship for an hour on Sunday? Not great stewardship, right? Diversification of income streams to ensure sustainability beyond traditional tithes and offerings. If we're just relying on plate donations, it's going to be a tough road for a lot of congregations. So these metrics, or things like this, would help assess the practical aspects of church vitality and sustainability in a blended ecology where the church is engaging both inherited and emerging models of ministry. So using metrics like this, congregations can better assess their missional health in a blended ecology. And these questions not only track the traditional measures like attendance and membership. We're not trying to throw those out or say those are irrelevant in this ecology metric thinking. But they'll also capture the holistic, relational, outward focus aspects of ministry. So how do we move beyond maintenance metrics to missional metrics? The fresh expressions and other creative experiments potentially provide a hopeful way forward. And the focus of fresh expressions is to cultivate communal life in Jesus with people not currently connected to the inherited church. It's not merely about revitalizing dying churches or ensuring the survival of the denomination. Instead, fresh expressions embody the self-donation of the church, reaching the unchurched, the marginalized, the excluded, the harmed, by cultivating contextual missional expressions of the gospel. And thus the movement provides a framework to shift away from the institutional default mode of self-preservation toward the Jesus way, the Jesus mode of self-donation. Think of John 12:24. Unless a seed go into the ground and die, it can't experience resurrection. But by focusing outward, adjusting key metrics, creating leadership pathways that prioritize mission over mere maintenance, the church can refocus and reestablish itself as a dynamic force for disciple making and societal transformation in the 21st century. To effectively measure church vitality in the era of what we need transvocational ministry, it is essential to move beyond the traditional metrics of maintenance and focus on missional outcomes. And the church's vitality should be assessed based on the relationships it builds, the community engagement it fosters, and the transformative impact it has on the world. Traditional metrics like attendance and financial giving fail to capture the dynamic outward-facing nature of the church's mission. And by adopting a mixture of, counting metrics and narrative-based metrics and measuring metrics, and using that approach to measurement that integrates insight from sociology and scales and tools and assessments, the church can better assess their role in the world, capture both qualitative and quantitative data. We capture a lot of quantitative data. We don't do a lot with it, but we're really light on the qualitative side of things. And these new metrics align with the Fresh Expressions movement, emphasizing holistic understanding of church vitality that includes both inherited and emerging forms of church, Antioch and Jerusalem, stationary and sent. So ultimately, by embracing these new missional metrics, the church can ensure it remains resilient, true to its mission of making disciples for the transformation of the world. And it reminds us that maintenance is not the mission. These metrics actually bring us to the heart of the matter. Realize change for the better. Flesh and blood incarnational communities that transfigure the world. How do we measure this? The question that comes up a lot. This is an attempt to try to formulate a response to that recurring question. So, hey, thank you for listening to Compassion Matters. If this episode resonated with you and added a bit more compassion to your life, please take a moment to subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a review. We'd love to hear how you're engaging with the concepts of incarnational community and healing loneliness in your own life. And if you want to dive deeper, follow the link on Substack. Please subscribe to the Substack. That's our major form of communication. And to connect with us and learn more about the Passional Church movement, check out passiodei.com. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Compassion matterized. Let's make it matter. Hey, see you next time.